Take your Bibles, if you would, turn to Psalm 2. Psalm 2 this morning. The God who laughs extends mercy. A wonderful text. This is the second of the psalm. Psalm 2, the God who laughs extends mercy. If you don't have a Bible, grab that black book in front of you, not the hymn book, the other book. And you can take that book with you if you don't have a copy of the Scriptures. And you can take that one home. We'll fill it back. It's on page 448. 448 in that book. I noticed that some of the newer Bibles that are out there are not going according to that page number. I was informed this. We got a new set of Bibles. So you may have a new one. If you do, look it up. It's in the middle of somewhere. Just kind of crack open. You'll find Psalms. Okay? And this is the second one. Let's read this together. You read quietly as I read it aloud. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me. I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel.' Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." This is God's word, and let's be very careful this morning how we hear it. Last week we sat on the front porch, and we had this conversation with Yahweh, God himself. We sat on the front porch of his great glory, and I call glory here his multifaceted perfections. As we look at his perfections, they are multifaceted. They glimmer and they show beautiful, pure light. And while the front porch visits are really a special treat, especially with the Creator God himself speaking, there's something even more special when he allows us the privilege of coming inside and seeing the integral parts of his glory. And we come inside the house, as it were. One can learn much about the family of God, but one can also learn much about our families as you come into the house where they live. If you remember, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are like two pillars that stand at the grand entrance into the entire Psalter. Psalm 1 begins with a blessing on the man. Psalm 2 ends with a blessing on all. This tells us that everything in between the two psalms sets the pace for all that will follow. And if you don't enter the front porch, and if you actually don't go inside of the house itself, you will not get a full grasp of God's glory. So we want to do that before we enter into the Psalter. God speaks to the individual in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man. But as we go and perhaps into the sitting room, God continues to speak. And there's this great expansion as he speaks. The emphasis changes away from the individual, the blessed man, and Yahweh turns the spotlight on the larger view of community, of nations, of peoples, plural. It is now in the sitting room, as it were, where Yahweh teaches us that we were never designed to be alone. We weren't designed to be to ourselves. As a reflection of our triune God, we are made for community. We are made for fellowship. We are made for personal reaction and reliance on one another. And as one writer says it, my faith always exists in the realm of our faith. This is why we meet together. This is why we don't enjoy online. And I know some of you are online, and we welcome you today. But I would say to you, that's not the intention of God's people. God's people need to meet. We were designed that way. And Psalm 2 reminds us that those who would trust into Christ live in a world where faith then must be lived out. And I would want you to see this, that our faith is lived out through the testing of our trust in God. It is through the trying of our faith that it is seen throughout the body of believers. It is through confirming our faith and strengthening our faith and stretching our faith and causing us to persevere in those trials in public so that all can see. Because God is at work. Yahweh is front and present in all of this. And all of it's done then in the public eye, as it were, in front of community, in front of the family. And in all reality, nothing is ever hidden. All of it eventually does come out. Our trust, our reliance, and our dependence upon God will come out over time. Or our self-willed determinism and our self-rule will be revealed for all to see. It will not ever be hidden. Over time, it's revealed. How you live your life, either in pursuing God or pursuing self, will eventually be seen. That's the point of what we will see here. Psalm 1 speaks to us about the importance of the written word. Or as he said last week, the Torah. And instruction from the Torah. But Psalm 2 speaks to us about the importance of the living word, Jesus himself, or God and his anointed one. Psalm 1 reminds us that our individual lives should be God-centered, should be word-filled. But Psalm 2 turns the page to the other side to teach us that the whole world is really ultimately God-centered. It doesn't look like that now, does it? But we will see it is really God-centered and that Jesus really is king and he does really rule. On the front porch, we learned a little bit about Sinai. We learned the Torah. We learned the law. And the law was given there in Sinai. Today, we get to go to Zion, where the king rules. And the point of Psalm 2 is this. Even though it doesn't look like it or feel like it, Jesus rules. And Jesus extends mercy. I will say this, as you've heard me say so many times. The very fact that you and I are here in this room today is an indication that we serve a merciful, gracious God. Not one of us deserve one more breath. Yahweh reminds us of this in Psalm 2. So while sitting in the room with Yahweh, we see the portraits of his son. But we're still here to listen to him. Yahweh's tone is very direct in chapter 2 or Psalm 2. And in 4 stanzas, we catch yet another view of his perfections and our salvation in Christ. So let's look at the 4 stanzas. Listen to Yahweh. And one of the first things that he says in stanza 1, we see this in verses 1 through 3, know your world. It's very good for us this morning to recognize the world that we live in. We're not told this in our text anywhere, but David writes this psalm. And the only way we know that is in Acts chapter 4, verse 25. Peter and John tell us that they perhaps sing this psalm when they'd been arrested for speaking of the risen Jesus. And so no doubt David, when he wrote this, looked around his world and was very troubled at the godlessness of his world. This was very personal with David. He had experienced what he was writing about. He had seen the rulers of this world conniving together against him and against God. We also know that there is somewhat a prophetic voice in David's word here. And what we learn here has been around ever since there's been sin, but we will also begin to catch a glimpse of even things that will come someday for these people and even for us. And today it becomes very practical as well. Verse 1 is very sharp and to the point. Why do the nations rage? He gets right to the point. He's not vacillating. He's not kind of playing games and going like, what is going on in our world today? And the people plot in vain. So David was astonished at the complete disregard for the Lord and the depths to which man took this sin, and they would sink deep into this darkness. But I would tell you this morning, this is our world. It is under the curse of God, and we are filled with layers upon layers, generations and generations of sin. Now, the question that he asks is a legitimate question. Why doesn't man realize God is the source from which all blessings flow? Why does man think that he can live life apart from God? Why doesn't man realize that apart from God there is no real peace or no real joy? Why? Well, let's listen to Yahweh as he explains. Notice, first of all, know that it is a hostile world. He says this, the nations rage. Rage. All through this psalm, there's this immediate meaning that is going on. But you have to read just a little bit more to see that, okay, there's something else that he's alluding to. There's an immediate meaning, but there's also this far away meaning. And we begin to see this unfold as we go close. As the up close meaning would be how the Jewish people see themselves around other nations. To them, there was the Jew, and then there were the rest of the nations, or what they would call the Gentiles. The Jewish nation experienced this rage, this hostility. They experienced it in Egypt, where they were treated poorly. And then they also experienced it with all the nations that fought against them. And some of you will remember when we went through the book of Joshua, all these battles of these nations, of these people, would go against the people of God. David would understand this. He understood the history. But their experience would remind them that the other nations had no tolerance for them and no tolerance for their God. But understand something. This is not a mild apathy towards God. This is a deep-rooted hatred for God, a hostility, a rage, and it is a rage against Yahweh. It's a rage against God. The word rage here means to surge, to literally roar, to be in constant agitation. It is a pacing back and forth with much noise. And this is the noise, the restlessness of nations. It's a fierce picture. And they are constantly plotting and scheming and conniving against God and his people. My friend, do you not see how this is even happening in our world today? It's war. It is a strident rebellion. It is filled with hate, and it spews out of their heart with a sharp and killing venom. You see this in our world today. You see our leaders and people who connive, and what they do is they begin to work out details which God can be squelched, and God's people can be shut down, can be canceled, can be rendered powerless. It's a hostile world, but it doesn't stop there. The hostile world always spills out in them doing something. And what they do is they persecute. They persecute. And this has been going on for decades, for centuries. But it begins with a real hate towards God. That's where it always begins. But then this hate is poured over into God's people. And so the psalmist David uses this idea, the Lord and his anointed, and that his anointed has a very specific meaning. In our interpretation, we interpret it in light of other scriptures. And so we would ask ourselves, how did the early church then view this particular psalm? It helps us in our own interpretation. Well, listen to the words of Peter and John as they connect the dots for us. Because in Acts chapter 4, again, in verse 27, they're in their preaching and they say this, for truly in this city, they're speaking there in Jerusalem, they're gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom God you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles, and here's the peoples of Israel. Here it is. All the nations. They saw Psalm 2 as being lived out right in front of them. And all the nations are now plotting, including the Jews, all the nations, scheming, working hard to put to death God and his anointed. And in this particular case, they're speaking about Jesus. But understand, their angst is against God. Their heart is set against God. And that is why there's so much restlessness in our world today. When you go against the Creator, you're left with your own imagination. You're left with your own world. There's no truth in your own world. There's not. And when you push God away, you stand up and you go, oh, I don't want God. You're left with restlessness. There's no peace. There's no truth. There's no undergirding foundation. And it ends up into a real anger against God. And this spills over into persecution. You don't give me that stuff. You don't bring that stuff into my world, is what they're saying. There's so much restlessness. But here's what I want you to see. It is an irrational world as well. And you see this in verse 1. Notice that last little line where these people, they gather together, they scheme, but it's all in vain. The people plot in vain. One word that sums this whole first section up is the word why. Do you see that? Why? Now in the Hebrew there, it's called parallelism, where you often take one word that is used once, but it is meant for other statements. So there's a fourfold why. Why do they rage? Why do they plot? Why do they take counsel? Why do they go against the Lord and his anointed? Why? That, my friend, is the spirit of restlessness. What is going on here? Who's in control? Can't we do something about this? But this why is given to provoke thought to something that just seems so irrational. David answers this at the end of verse 1. They do this in vain. In other words, it is futile. It is absurd. It is irrational to think that you can out-scheme God. What you're doing doesn't make sense. It's irrational. You will not and you cannot out-scheme God. Listen to me. If you're here today and you know God, you know of his word, but you want to live your own life, to do your own thing, can I just urge you to understand you cannot make it. You cannot out-scheme God. Only God is God. That's the point here. It's an irrational world. But then it's a foolish world. We see this in verse 3. Look at verse 3. We see this all over the place. Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. This is a willful, rebellious people, and their king's now speaking with one voice with astonishing foolishness. Why this hostility? Why this animosity and rejection? Well, they desire autonomy. I don't want to be told what to do. And so they say this, let us burst their bonds. Well, what are the bonds that they're talking about here? These are the bonds of God. And isn't the bonds of God bonds of love? Bonds of grace? The bonds of the law, God's holiness? And what they're saying here is, let's cast away their cords. This is an agricultural picture of two oxen bound together with a yoke and leather straps called cords. Everyone would have known exactly what the psalmist was saying. And they would hold the oxen together connected with this yoke. So it was very important, those cords, that yoke. And what he's saying here is God's love is what keeps life together. God's grace, God's mercy, all of those are the connections in life. Listen to me. When you set aside God, you're set aside and you're putting off those things, grace, love, and mercy in your life. And you're saying, I don't want to be told what to do by those. I want to get rid of them. The cords then are these things that tie everything together in life. And he's saying, let's get rid of that. Man, don't tell me how to love people. Don't tell me what grace means in my own life. God's commandments, we don't want to do that. That word burst here literally means to root it out. And we've seen this, haven't we? I mean, let's get prayer and Bible reading out of the schools. Let's get it out of there. And in the courts, let's get the 10 Commandments out of our courtroom. And even in our churches, let's not talk about sin. Let's not talk about the law. Let's just do what we want to do. Let's burst it aside. Put God's word far from us. Well, these things stifle our desires. They cramp our freedoms and they deny our happiness. And God is just this big spoiler. Let's just let our scientific, rational thought rule us, and let's be done with these crazy yokes of God and religion. Well, let me ask you a question. How's it going? Really? Are we free in America today? I don't think so. Because we see a world that is strapped in the bonds of fear. We see a world that is strapped in the bonds and the cords of loneliness and futility and frustration and hopelessness. And we are in bondage to anxiety, and we live in the realm of horrible relationships. Behind closed doors at homes, there's horrible relationships going on. Why do the nations shout out against God? How did all the scheming of the nations really work against Christ? Let's go back to that text in Acts chapter 4. Peter and John make it very clear in chapter 4 and in verse 27 and 28. He says, there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles and the people of Israel. And here's what he says, God, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. All that scheming was really God using their anger in a sinless way to do what needed to be done to the Son of God so that we could have salvation. God was behind it all. All that scheming, where did it get you? Where did it really get you? You see, our hostile world is a persecuting world. It's an irrational world and it's a foolish world, but it will not have its own way. Let me ask you a question this morning. Do you believe that? Are you convinced that evil will not have its own way? And let me just tell you, if you feast on the news, and some of you feast on Fox News, and all they do is stir up this fear, and they don't really give you any good resolution to that fear because they keep pointing you back to humanity and away from God. Let me just tell you, when you feast on that, you will not find rest until you understand that evil will not win. It won't. You ever noticed how agitated Christians are today? During this whole pandemic, people are angry. They're hostile. They're irrational. And they're foolish. But where does that anger get them? Just look on social media. Where does it really get them? They're venting on social media, and they're shooting at one another, and they're jumping on with strong anger and fury on one another. And you're just going like, what are you doing? Your take on this particular issue, it doesn't win. Only God wins. And you know what? You're not you're not a doctor. You're not. Why do we do that? Why? All that plotting's in vain. Does anger and hostility really get them anywhere in life? No, it doesn't. And so God says, listen to my voice. Verse 4. Look at this. Verse 4. He who sits in the heaven laughs. Yahweh responds to all of this by giving us two lessons. The first lesson is a moving and sobering picture. In response to the arrogance of godless humanity and all their conniving and scheming, the one enthroned in heaven, God the Creator, the very Father of the universe, laughs. And this is a moving picture. I remember as a teenager sitting there listening to that, I'm going like, wait, does he laugh? He laughs. But this is a laughter unlike we've never heard of before. This is not a laughter of hilarity, but of divine derision, mockery, and contempt. It is a holy laughter. It is a laughter that we have no category for. We don't grasp exactly what this is about. He is unmoved at the conspiracy theories about the might of men. God is not fazed by your view of this world. You have the mighty and the suave politicians and the dictators that are strutting around, throwing out laws, overtaking people groups. You have the mighty military with bombs strapped on their backs. God is unimpressed. He laughs. Will their nuclear bombs destroy God's kingdom? He laughs. The very question causes him to break out in laughter. And be careful that you don't have this toned down mentality. Like, it doesn't really mean that God is sarcastic or derisive, does it? I think it does. I think that's exactly what it means. That's the picture that he gives to us here, so that we would hear it. And you say, how do you know that? Because of what we just read in verses 1 through 3. This is a rebellion. This is a strident giving of oneself will against God. It doesn't make sense. It's irrational and it's foolish. See the pictures of Christians who've been burned at the stake, beheaded, and see the one Jesus himself who was crucified. Now we begin to understand God's wrath. Look at verse 5. He says this, then he will speak to them in his wrath. And stop right there, my friend. Listen to me. Be warned. God is a God of wrath. It's a just wrath. And people look at God and go like, well, he shouldn't be so angry like this. Read verses 1 through 3 again. Understand the depths of what he's talking about. He will terrify them. He will rebuke them in his anger because his absolute holiness moves him to justly judge the rebellious. And he speaks to them burning words of indignation. My friend, listen to Yahweh. And then he gives a historical announcement, and this is in verse 6. As for me, the only one that really matters in this world, I have set up my king on Zion, the holy hill. God is speaking of his choice of the covenant king here. And there's a sense of the immediate king that he's chosen, that he's talking about King David here, of course. But even more so, God is speaking together to this greater descendant king, the descendant of King David, the Messiah, Jesus himself. And this is the focus here. God goes back to the very beginning and he points to Zion. Why Zion? What is Zion? Well, the first time Zion is mentioned is in 2 Samuel 5, verse 7. It is a Jebusite fortress that David takes from the Jebusites. It's a stronghold. It's a place where much battle went, and David conquers it. It's a tiny 11-acre piece of land on the southeast edge of Jerusalem. I will plant my kingdom there, is what God is saying. Daniel 2 later will tell us that Zion will become a great mountain. But now it is just a tiny, and some call it a banana-shaped piece of land on the backside of Judah. And the words "I have set" are the words of past conclusion. And the word "I" is emphatic. I have set this. I have put it there. Notice the pronouns here. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. You begin to understand who is in charge here? God is in charge here. The Creator God. This world is His. My friend, listen to me today. All of life is all about God. This world is His. And notice thirdly, not only does Yahweh speak, not only does David speak in the first stanza, the third stanza, the Son speaks. And Yahweh says to us, listen to my son. And we see this in verses 7 through 9. We find this in another voice. It is the voice of the Messiah himself. And he speaks of a prophecy of something that points directly to himself. Notice the timing in verse 7. Notice what he says here. I will tell of the decree. What is the decree? A decree is a pronouncement by the triune God of how things will be. And Jesus is pointing to something that happened before time that actually points to him and his opportunity to incarnate and take on himself man. And so the triune God decreed this incarnation of Jesus, and the words, "You are my son," or "This is my beloved son," were spoken of Jesus by the Father twice during his earthly ministry. One at his baptism and one at his transfiguration. But it would be at his resurrection and ascension where the entire moment of this will be fulfilled. And this is why Jesus stands in Matthew and he says, "All authority is given unto me." And we'll see this unfold later. So he's dealing with timing here. God's in charge of when this will take place. But also notice the extent, and we see this in verse 8. "As for me, I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." We not only see when, but we see the extent of Christ's kingdom. The nations and the ends of the earth. There is nothing more than that, right? There are the nations outside of the Jewish world. Everything else, my inheritance, the inheritance of the Son will include not only you Jews, but the rest of the nations to the ends of the earth. That pretty well sums up the whole universe, right? That's the extent. But notice the power. And this is in verse 9. And he says this, "You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." Earlier I said this somewhat prophetic. Here's the prophetic. Because this same words are used in Revelation 19. Same thing. And the picture here is the rod of iron. The rod is the picture of his rule, and it's of iron. It is the most hard thing that they have. And it's compared to as it will strike a clay pot. I don't usually buy clay pots. Some of you know I do some flowers and stuff in my backyards. I don't usually use clay. You know why? Because over time they just fall apart. But if you can imagine the strength of an iron rod smashing this clay pot, the picture here is one of total rule. And the payment will be priceless. Some of you know we've recently gotten a cute, darling little puppy. Literally like that big. She's 2.9 pounds. She's a Pomeranian. We had a Pomeranian. Some of you know we had Annie before. 14 years. We have now Tater Tot. I know, it's cheesy. I understand that. But she's adorable. And what cracks me up is that little girl thinks, we put her on her leash, she thinks she can go anywhere she wants to. And she's going out there and she pulls and pulls and pulls to the point where it's almost choking her. She goes, but she won't stop. She'll keep doing that. I'm going like, yeah, this is what we think we're doing, only in much, much bigger picture. This is how we're acting against God. We think that I can pull and tug and do whatever I want to do, and God cannot control me. My friend, you're a tater. And God is God. Christ will someday consign his enemies to his relentless wrath in hell forever. Please believe that, because it's true. It doesn't seem like it, does it? But Christ rules with all power. Finally, I want you to see this. Look at verse 10 with me. There's so much more I could say, but notice verse 10 with me. Receive God's mercy. So God states all of this is true. He understands the dynamic of this rebellion, and he says this, and he comes again. We see words that pivot the focus of Yahweh. Now, therefore. It's like he's going like, you've got one more chance. Now listen to me. Because of everything that I've said, you, kings of the earth. And I think you can include not only the kings of the earth, but the people of the earth. Listen to what I say. Now, therefore. Hear this. And it's just Yahweh uses this the thing that mankind often uses against God. In other words, mankind says, well, you just use your logic. There can't be a God. There can't be just one God. There's got to be several gods. It's a misplaced logic, but mankind tries to use logic. And what God says here is, if you really know me, use your logic and then conclude logically how utterly weak you are against me and my might, power, and glory. And so he says to the kings of the earth, those who should be wise already, who are really playing foolish ways and they're living, he says, you be wise. And I would say to you, you who have continued to push away from God, my friend, you're not being wise. So you be wise. Listen. Be wise. This is not a self-made wisdom. Wisdom in Scripture is always viewing life from God's viewpoint. Listen up. There is only one God, and you cannot outsmart this God. Be wise. Notice secondly, be warned. Here's one more opportunity of mercy. And this is God's kind mercy one more time. And the indication here is you need the refuge of this God. My friend, listen to me this morning. I need the refuge of this God. You need the refuge of this God. So be warned. Notice thirdly, serve this God. You see that? Serve this God with fear and rejoice with trembling. Serve it with fear and rejoicing. With fear, that's the awe, rejoicing. I can't believe he's given me another day of living. Serve. And then finally, he says, kiss the Son. And there's so much more I could say here. Kiss the Son. This is not a romantic thing. It's a picture of subservience. It's a kiss of submission. The word son here is the Aramaic word, and frankly, many commentators want to go all over the place with this, but I would just say, understand what it's talking about. It's just a common thing that when one king came into the world of another king, or vice versa, it was a way of expressing submission to the king of wherever. The visiting king expressed this public expression of submission to the lordship that belonged to this king that you were coming in contact with. And different cultures have different ways of expressing this type of greeting. We don't do it this much here. But in France, there's this thing called the bisous. How many of you know what this is? The bisous? You know, where you kind of do this air kiss on one side and on the other. But it goes back to actually Roman times. And it speaks of openness and trust and acceptance and submission. That when you come and you on both sides like this, you're saying, I am your friend. And there's nothing hidden. It's an act because they still live hidden from each other. But you get the point. History dates back to the medieval times. Skirmishes and warfare was always going on, and it was difficult to tell the enemy from a friend. And one of the understood ways of distinguishing between a friend or foe was how they greeted each other. And if the one would greet the other and stick out one hand like this, it was always an indication of, I think I know you, you may be friend, but if not, I'm going to have my other hand on my sword. But if they knew and trusted the other friend, and knew it was a friend, they would stick out both hands. And they would grab each other's hands and welcome them and embrace in this way. My friend, this idea of kiss the Son is taking both hands of Christ and putting your whole self under Him. That's the picture. Blessed are all, not just the kings, not just the individual, but blessed are all who take this King for refuge. They run to this King for refuge. Not the kings of the earth who plot against God, but the real King Himself. And today, those who have placed your faith in Christ and are trusting wholly on Him come to what we call then the Lord's table. And we get to celebrate and remember this King, this Messiah. It's a vivid reminder that our violation of God's holiness and glory and glory is very real. Every time we partake of the Lord's Supper, it is a constant reminder that Christ's death, His perfect life, His victorious resurrection is a real thing. And we are looking forward to His return, which is a real thing. He will return for us. And we acknowledge the truth of that. And there are two signature elements, the bread and the cup, that speak of the blood and a torn body. And we would sit here and say, why so gruesome? Why blood? And why a piece of the body? Would we understand this because of the realities of verses 1 through 3? The sin that was committed was vile. That rebellion is gruesome. We are at enmity against God and His anointed. But Jesus came and poured out His blood, and His body was mangled so that we may be healed of our sinfulness and be granted righteousness. There is no other way to God. And every time we take this, we remind ourselves there's no other way to get to God except through the shed blood and the broken body of Jesus Christ.